Bitcoin, networked states, and biased algorithms. How do they relate? Is it time we implement higher data standards in tech? Today's episode not only answers these questions, but does so with our very first guest, Severin Deutschmann, founder and managing director of OpenTelos.com. And he shares his thoughts on network states enabling bottom-up regulation, algorithms being designed to control us, the data economy, weaponized algorithms, ethical tech and ethical algorithms, tech's influence on global affairs, censorship and freedom of speech, and how aspiring network state leaders can effectively influence bottom-up regulation. If anyone can build a network state, which both Balaji Srinivasan and Severin Deutschmann suggest is true, then isn't it imperative that we redefine tech standards as to ensure accountability among tech companies? The network state leaders of tomorrow will need to know what's gone wrong in the past and use that knowledge along with their skills to create a better future moving forward. In this episode, we dive into exactly what it would take for them to be successful. If you like the episode, please immaculately seduce that like button, share it with 2 people, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Please enjoy. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Network State Podcast. Today we are joined by Severin Deutschmann, and we're going to be talking about how network states can enable bottom-up regulation. So first, Severin, can you tell us about your background and how you got interested in network states?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say for me in around 2015, I became aware of things like blockchain, especially Ethereum, and these kind of things, which was back then a very alien but highly interesting concept, which drew me in and never kind of let me go from there. And I think that's also that really influenced my path. Ultimately, today I am running a small boutique studio or / agency that is doing design and development, also strategic consulting for projects in the Web3 space, and helping out some other projects. So I would say that's my bread and butter. There's also some other projects I'm involved in, we might or might not get into later. And how I would describe myself, I'm not really specialized in anything and would rather see myself as a generalist, really interested in a lot of things. There are some spots where I definitely have some deeper knowledge, but I'm really interested more in the broader things and then connecting things together and understanding reality through this lens.
Awesome. Okay. And so what about network states? Like, how did you come across the book, or what interested you in that?
Yeah, so I was really hyped when I saw Balaji announcing and then releasing his book on network states, because this is a concept that even before the book I was interested in. I wouldn't have called it network states, I would have called it something else, but it is fundamentally grounded in the realizations that come with being exposed to crypto, Web3, and the likes on a longer term. Because if you really want to understand blockchain, which is also why I really love this, is it is not just a technical concept, but it's also, it touches economy, it touches society, it touches culture, philosophy, and all of these kind of things, right? What is money, and etc. And then once you get all of these things together, and then you look at blockchain again, you see the kind of paradigm shift. And when you then extrapolate and think about what is possible in the long term, I think you arrive at something that is something like a network state, I would say. So I've been thinking about this, talking about this a long time with friends, and I'm super glad that Balaji put it together in such a great, distinct way, creating like a center meme, I would say, like a central meme that now people can arrange on, where we can just say, hey, let's talk about network states, instead of having like 1 hour of establishing something that we don't have a word for yet, right? So that's cool, and that's why I'm interested ultimately in this.
Totally agree. I think he like really made it easy for us to organize all these thoughts that we've had into one application. So speaking of that, let's jump into what do we mean when we say enabling bottom-up regulation? What does that mean for you?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two things to this, right? There's bottom up and regulation, right? Looking at regulation, I think most of us know this in terms of being like a more like a political term, right? So we have our economy, and then we have a state that is regulating the economy. But regulation can also be a term that comes more from the complexity and system sciences, right? For example, your thermostat is regulating the temperature in your room, right? So it's a way of it's coming from control theory, like controlling a system or steering a system in a certain direction, right? And so these go hand in hand. When I'm talking about bottom-up regulation, I mean this more in the sense of the political regulation, right? More on the global scale of the classic way that we see. And then if you look at bottom-up, well, most of the regulation that we see today, or basically, let's say most of it, comes from a top-down framework, right? Where we have a state that is from a top-down perspective saying, well, okay, we're going to tax petrol now more, therefore regulating the consumption of petrol in the economy, or we're making things like the FDA, like not allowing certain drugs or whatever, right? These kind of things. And the bottom-up version of this is basically, well, are there also instances of how regulation can happen that is not coming top-down from a big institution, but how can regulation happen more in a kind of grassroots sense, more in an emergent sense, right? More directed, coming out of the sovereignty from the individual, something like this. And I think to give examples there, we as consumers, we always have and still have to this day the power to influence supply chains, because ultimately we are the ones driving demand, right? And so awareness of consumers ends up having influence on these things. To make this more practical, well, at some point in the last century, we became aware, or we thought, for example, that fat is like the more fat you have in your yogurt, this is going to increase your weight gain, right? And when we believed this and consumers believed this, well, what we got were low-fat products, right? So, and I would say this is not something that the state mandated, but this is where people from the bottom up, kind of through their demand and consumption decisions, enacted something that I would call bottom-up regulation.
Okay, so just for getting on the same page with our listeners as well, right? We've got two types of regulation: top-down, which is coming from the government or whoever's in charge, whoever has power, and deciding how the rest of whoever is not in power should live. And you have the bottom-up, which is the people who do not have power coming together to gain power and then influence regulation at the top for the people who do have power to change that way. Is that right?
I wouldn't say that it's influencing the top, but it's just influencing the system directly, right? The low-fat yogurt just came into existence because people demanded it in this sense, right? And so they're through this, through people making the same decisions on a large enough basis, we get a difference in the world, a different outcome.
Got you. Okay, and so on that note, it seems that it's going to be very important for the leaders of these network states that could potentially enable this bottom-up regulation to have certain qualities, right? So you mentioned in your podcast episode with Samir Azizi, the network state and why the one commandment model is bad, that network leaders should be coming from a good place, from an authentic place, that they should be transparent and acting in goodwill. How should network state leaders enable bottom-up regulation while maintaining these standards? And what steps should they take, and what important issues should they consider when starting out, right? So let's just use the example of an aspiring network state leader who sees a moral or economic or philosophical issue and wants to address that with a network state? What are the steps? What qualities should they have? Let's break it down for them.
Yeah, so maybe one thing to add before that, to enrich this framing, like one of the beautiful things about the concept of a network state is that it's inherently opt-in, right? It's a non-coercive concept, right? And so keeping this in mind, I think that's how bottom-up regulation would arise in this context, right? Where network states are kind of proxies for groups of people, and then can, like a union, right, pool their inherent power, but that is divided right now, but then pool this together and then represent them in actually enacting talking with other companies, etc., for example, right, expressing the quote unquote will of the people, right? And so to go then to your question, what an aspiring network leader should take from this, I think, is I think listening to the people that you're representing, and also being clear about what you stand for and what you don't stand for, so you attract the right people from the get-go, and so you don't have too much conflict down the road. You will always have conflict, right? But you are at least directionally aligned, and this enables you then to do the best job of being the proxy for this bottom-up regulation approach, so to speak.
Yes. Okay. So to start off, we have these qualities as a leader, right? And then there's got to be a step where they're organizing these values, or they're organizing these thoughts, or they're organizing these people in a certain way to have an impact. So how do we get from that, or how do we take that step?
Yeah, so I think there's like a critical mass that you would be looking for, right? And this always depends on the context or the system that you're looking at, right? Like a critical mass can be 10 people if you're talking about your local neighborhood, right? And this can be an amazing starting point, right? You're also minimizing the negative impact you can have if you're actually not doing something well, right? And then if you're scaling this up and if you're going bigger, depending on what you want to influence, you need more people to come together to get to this critical mass, right? Once you have a certain mass, what you achieve is that you basically are able to talk to certain entities that wouldn't listen to you before, right? If I today go to Zara and say, hey, I love your products, I love the style that you have, but I have some issues with the way that you are going about producing your products. Maybe you want to kind of shift this a little bit to keep me as your customer. That would be like, yeah, I don't care. Like, who are you? Why are you talking to me, right? But the moment it's not just me, but it's like, I don't know, like 1,000 people in a certain market or even more, right? Maybe then they start listening, right?
And especially if it's a market that is producing business for them, right? That actually contribute to their bottom line, because it means they would lose that business if they don't listen.
Exactly. It's about having actual leverage, right? Like in theory, we as a population, we as citizens, we have this power, but what stops us from leveraging this power in our own interest is missing coordination, right? Divide and conquer, right? As long as we are divided, so easy to conquer us, right? But the moment we come together, right, this enables us to also become more capable and have more leverage. So our direct leverage is the purchasing power that we have and that we can direct, right? And you can see how, like, if you imagine you had, let's stick with the example of Zara, you have 20% of every Zara customer on the world unionized under one umbrella and with a certain kind of alignment and a will to do collective action, right? Well, at this point, it's not about listening, but at this point, you can say, well, give us 5% off of everything that you have, otherwise we stop buying. Like that, you can even go like to like very heavy-handed side on the other things, right?
Yeah.
Like to the extremes. Yeah, yeah. But that's the power that is inherently there, and the missing coordination is what's stopping us from getting there, right?
So this concept of collective action we've covered in some previous episodes, but for those of you listening for the first time, is just having the ability to coordinate enough people in a way where their actions are as if they were one, right? And it's not fractured. So the example Balaji uses frequently is, I'm going to make a tweet and 1,000 of you will retweet it. And that's exactly what's going to happen. And it's not going to be, you know, like, hey guys, please retweet this, and 50 of them do, and, you know, 900 plus don't. It's very collective. It's everyone's agreed to do it. And so it happens. So when this collective action is compounded with thousands, tens of thousands, millions, you start to see how it can become extremely powerful if really every single person is taking an action that has little influence alone, but massive influence together. And so now we have these ideas or these problems that we're facing in society, economic or otherwise, moral. And I, as an individual, I'm just using myself as an example, has a problem with the way that the oceans are being polluted, right? As an example, or like climate change, or, you know, we should say like the kinds of negative effects that are happening in the climate. And I want to do something about it. I think first and foremost, you need a problem that's big enough, that impacts enough people, that enough people would care and want to do something about it, right? And then you need this technology to facilitate the organization of these people and the directing of this collective action in a way that makes sense, right? So some of the ways that we've seen this, and I'm sure you've seen as well in DAOs, is, or even with Ethereum as a whole, people being able to put out proposals and everybody else in the community getting to vote on those proposals. And if they hit enough of a majority, they get implemented. Is this the kind of same process that we're going to be seeing with network states, where in order to get that collective action, how do we get everybody to buy in? How do we organize them? How do we communicate? How do we vote on what happens? You know, what makes that powerful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think in the context of network states, especially in the, let's say, in a Balaji sense, right? I don't think that, for example, voting and implementation of proposals is a fundamental part of it. It can be, and it can make sense if that is what you believe in, right? If you think that's how governance should happen, how you enable participation, etc., right?
Yeah.
But you can certainly think about systems where you don't have this kind of voting participation, but maybe other ways of engaging people, synthesizing the collective will, so to speak, and then enacting this, right? And then maybe one thing I'm thinking about, right? I'm not sure if this is actually plausible and will happen, but I'm happy to share and let other people be the judge of it, right? Mm-hmm. Is like the idea of, I think if you have a network state or a network union, right? A community of people with the will to collective action behind shared values, shared vision, shared goals. And you bring these people together, I think you then can also think in terms of, well, let's just imagine, let's take your ocean pollution, a value that you have that is very dear to you. So you might be part of a network union / network state that has exactly this position, right? There might be another network state / union that has a slightly different position, where they say, well, for us, the most important thing is actually right now, plastic pollution in general, right? And so while these are not exactly the same thing, and some touch the land, some touch the ocean, etc., they also have a big overlap, right? And I think that's where where it's really useful to have these organizing units where you have a leadership team at the top that then can spend the energy and spend the time to scout the environment, to find other network states and unions. They then can again with create like a next level, right? Like kind of like a UN model or what have you, or G7, right? And then like the
Right.
P7, because like the plastic pollution 7, right? And then your ocean union would also join them, right? And this is like a way how you can have many different network unions, but that then galvanize bigger majorities through discussion and dialogue with others and seeing what makes sense, where you can work together, right?
I think this is a great point, and we've seen it already in the traditional world because of organizations like NATO, right? So even with individual countries, but with shared values, who can then galvanize into these even more powerful groups to influence even more powerful groups, right? It just kind of builds and builds. And so having, a kind of UN of network states is an exciting possibility as well, especially when it comes down to regulating international affairs, right? And so we can see this bottom-up regulation happening on, a very micro scale, like we talked about, like if it's just your neighborhood or the building that you live in or within your community, and then at a statewide level, and then at a countrywide level, and then potentially at an international level. And so I want to focus and just finish off just how this would look for the consumer, right, the individual, to join this and how that would look. And then I want to jump into how this would look on the macro, on the B2B side. But so to wrap up for the consumers, they're able to organize these entities with this shared mission, these shared values, these shared communication tools. How does that then, or how do you bring that leverage? What if there are ways that you've seen that are effective? How do you then bring that leverage to the decision makers to put that pressure and actually influence change?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's I think there's two paths, or probably more than two, but two that I'm seeing right now. One is by just, well, like we already see these things, right, where it's like, oh, let's sign a petition on things, and you see, hey, there's like 1,000 people, 10,000 people that are supporting this issue, right? So it's probably good for my brand to also support this issue, for example, right? So just by showing up, showing your support for this thing, I think this already works. And then I think there's also the like the equivalent of force, right? Like network states, they don't have at least for the longest time they won't have like something like a military, like maybe way into the future there's something like private security, etc., whatever, but let's not go there. But what they do have is they still have power and leverage, which is, for example, the consumption decision. So maybe, well, if nobody is listening to you, but you have a big group of coordinated action, right? Maybe it's just you have to do a demonstration of force, right? For example, right, you're saying, hey, like, we love your products, we love your company, right? But these and these practices, they are not, they don't go with our values, right? And then so you basically can say, hey, well, we stop consuming from them. We're buying different products right now, and this will then be felt on the balance sheet, right there where it's felt, right? And so that would then should then give you the attention from the people that you want, and also demonstrate that you are able, that your community is able to actually enact the is capable of collective action, right? And once you demonstrated this, you're probably in a different position.
So it's generally in a public sphere, kind of in the ways that we're seeing cancel culture happen today, but for the purpose of accomplishing that network state's mission, right? So applying public pressure in a way that it's unavoidable for the entity that you're trying to influence to ignore, and and then leaving the decision to them, like, well, either you do something about it or X is going to happen, right? It's kind of a carrot and a stick situation for them at that point. Okay, cool. So now in your article on Medium, Why We Need User-Controlled Algorithms to Save Ourselves and Our Planet, you mentioned that this data economy is largely dominated by a handful of giant tech companies such as Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. And these companies have amassed vast troves of data on billions of users and use this data to fuel their algorithms. So what I'm noticing from this is that these massive companies have such power because of all the data that they own. And not only that, but it's not necessarily people at the top of these organizations influencing this power. It's the algorithms that they've built that are themselves, by virtue of how they were built, influencing culture and governments and the way that people organize. And so I wanted to ask you, how fairly do you think these algorithms are being built? Or let's go through the process of that. And then how does that impact bottom-up regulation?
Yeah, love to do so. So, well, I think they are inherently not acting in an omni-considerate interest, or like in an omni-considerable way. So what I mean by this is they are not optimizing for the greater good, but they are inherently optimizing for the good of those that are controlling them, right? And this is just very simple economy 101, how we believe the economy works, how it should work, right? We want to make profit. And so that is ultimately what these algorithms are doing, like any other product in the market out there, basically, right? And so this is ultimately the problem, because of this narrow framing of success, we get externalities that somebody else has to pay for in this case, because it's globally influencing phenomena. It's everybody in society, right? And we see this today. We see this in ourselves, like how our attention span is dwindling by the minute and these kind of things. And this is a externality that somebody else is carrying for the sake of somebody else making profit on these things, right? So I think the ultimate problem here is incentive misalignment of every stakeholder involved, right? And so if you take this perspective and this analysis, this is why I'm saying we need and we want user controlled algorithms, because you could also say, well, algorithms in general are bad, right? But that's like saying, well, my house burned down, so we should ban fire, right? But it's how the fire is used, right? Fire is extremely powerful. It is basically how we generate energy to an extent, right? So so instead of this, let's fix those. And I think the way we fix this is by, well, algorithms are powerful tools. They are amazing tools. I think they can really help, especially in a age where we have more information, more choice, more knowledge than any single human being could even scratch the surface of. So we need those algorithms to help us curate what is relevant to us, right? Or we want those. And they can be amazing tools to help us make better decisions. But to do so, like, I think the only way is that the user ultimately has the control of the algorithm, right? I want to be, and so this comes down what I would call as, well, I want to control the algorithm that is controlling me, right? That's the kind of world I want to live in. And so, yeah, I think that is a good summary of the idea.
So ultimately, we have to remember that these algorithms are created by humans, or rather groups of humans, and that means that they can be edited, they can be changed. And we've seen many examples of where bias has been ingrained in the algorithms being built, and that causes systemic issues. But by calling those issues out and calling attention to them, especially as we just talked about, in a public way, and to kind of like socially shame these companies to do the right thing. But ultimately, that there is somebody or a group of people that is in charge and making that happen. And so it can be influenced in a better direction that better serves the whole. So on that same note, in the same article, you said that algorithms are not designed to help us, but to control us, and that they hijack our brains and require us to use more willpower to say no. Can you talk more about how this works and how network states could use this psychology to manipulate people without people even realizing that they're being targeted?
Yeah, so I mean, like the way that the hijacking works is well, it's not really known, because what we essentially have is like the way that the algorithms are built today, like in a very simplified way, is like where we have like a black box that has some ability to learn, right? And then we say, hey, this is kind of the variable we want you to optimize for, right? So I guess it's, for most of these platforms, it's time spent on site, right?
Mm.
And so and then the algorithm is just like testing, right? Imagine A/B testing, right? But it's not just simple A/B testing, but it's just like fueled by giant data centers. A lot of energy is being used, and a lot of compute is being used there to find out, and then A/B test ultimately in vivo how what kind of tactics lead to this result, right? And then you just get a optimization towards this, right? And what seems to be the case, for example, is, well, if I'm showing you outrage, right? If I can make you outraged, well, you're going to keep on consuming this thing. Oh, I'm so outraged. Oh, like, oh, what is happening? Blah, 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 right? And while this made great for the platform, it's probably detrimental for the individual, right? Maybe for the individual, exactly what the individual needs is, well, I don't know, let's maybe show you something that challenges your beliefs, right? But the problem is, right, this leads to an individual generally growing as a human if we're presented with like new perspective and these kind of things. The problem is also that growing relates to pain and or effort, right? So when we're presented with different perspectives, then we have to work a lot, and then we're probably only gonna spend 30 minutes on site, and then we need to like let me go off, let me take a walk outside, let me think
Recharge
about this,
a little
right?
bit. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's not what we want to see generally, right? And so I think that's kind of the vector by which we are moving away from what's good, true, and beautiful, and towards something that is more dystopian and unenjoyable for everybody involved.
Yeah. So it's really, just to like tie this all together to make the point, there are multiple levels to how these network states can be used. We've got the consumer level, we've got the influencing the companies level, but then most importantly, we have the influencing the algorithm level, right? Because although companies are the ones running these algorithms, it's actually more difficult to notice how these algorithms start to not serve us. And by us, I mean humanity as a whole. And so we have to first evince that, and then also realize how it has influenced in a negative or positive way. And that also has to be a discussion in public. And then we have to determine what to do with that as a result of coming to that. So going over how each of these steps of regulation happen, I want to go through how do we determine who is really responsible and accountable for these kinds of errors, and then how they go, how do we fix them, right? So, this is something that we've talked about a lot with Twitter recently being acquired by Elon Musk and trying to maximize freedom of speech. And so the question arises, should tech companies or should network states or should governments be responsible for regulating freedom of speech? Who's really whose decision is that? And if so, how should they go about censorship to minimize harm while also maximizing freedom?
Yeah. So, I mean, look. So one thing is here is the question. Well, do we like how is change going to happen? Is change going to happen by changing the existing companies / institutions, right? There's like the saying, you can't teach an old dog a new trick, right? And there's probably some truth to that. So there's some heavy inertia there to move, but it's plausible that if you have a big enough aligned group of people or users that you can influence and have change there and move this in a certain direction. And Twitter is certainly some kind of example of this, though different. I think it's then to your question. Well, your question is kind of a loaded question because it already takes the perspective of a certain set of values, right? How do we maximize speech? How do we minimize harm, right? These are all
Exactly. Yeah.
these are all questions that are derived from your perspective, your worldview, or whoever you are like representing there, right? And so I think it's not about like answering these questions, but it's more about how it's probably more like how and if a new paradigm of network states or world of network states can create a world in which the in which the economy and the systems and the organizations are better aligned with the general will of all stakeholders touched by whatever it is they are doing, right?
Yeah.
And I
I just
think
want
this
to
is
I want to hover on that for 1 second just to clarify, because that's a really important point. Just thinking of the model as there is a correct answer, and so like my answer coming from more a liberal perspective, but there are all kinds of different answers, and understanding that actually the governing bodies that decide how a group of people should live or what they value or whatever, the smaller they are, the more relevant they become, because it's much easier to triage values within a building than it is within a country, than it is within an international stage, right? And so I think what you're saying is understanding that there can be many different organizations that do this, and that they only affect the people that they affect, is a direction that could solve a lot of these problems, because it's now, let's just solve this micro issue for all the people that it's affecting in this smaller entity. And then as the issues affect more and more people, you need bigger and bigger entities to decide. But the smaller you go, the more relevant the regulation will be for you and the people in that entity. And so the more satisfied you will be, because there will be less things to disagree on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's go into this point. I think this is interesting. So I would challenge the perspective that it's easier to find consensus in your building than on a global stage, right? It's probably about the same, and maybe like in a building you get even like you get very like these stories of neighbors that really hate each other, right?
That's a great point. Yeah, you argue about way less important things, and you start arguing about things that are just like minutia to most people that you would never talk about on a global stage. So yes,
exactly, right. And you come into conflict in these settings, right? I think Balaji calls this like the move away from like I think this is like but this highlights an issue that we have in general, right? And this also shows how or why it's why the idea of a network state is an important one to discuss and play around with is because we live in a paradigm where our communities, our governance is inherently organized around geographical closeness, right? And he says, well, what about if we instead organize around, I think it's geodesical closeness, right? So if you group together with it's probably hard for you to find just by coincidence someone in your building that cares as much about the ocean as you do, right? But once you are like on Facebook, Instagram, or just on a global stage on the internet, it's very easy for you to find people that have like exactly the same fire. It might be just 1 in 1,000 people, but you can find those and you can suddenly get into in community with them, right? And align around those issues. And so I think this is kind of like one of the big opportunities or potentials here that seem to be inherent to the concept is the reorganization of governance in a sense, right? Where we then suddenly can move into these groups and then become like these meta-organisms in a sense, right? Like the reason a company is so powerful is, well, it's 1,000, 100,000 people working together, having millions of dollars at their disposal, and everybody moving in the same direction. That's why they can have such a big influence. They can topple small governments and can, if they're large enough, be more powerful than a sovereign state, right? It's just because of size and these kind of things, right? So size matters in this
Yes.
context to a degree, right? But by using network state, I think we make the same pathways possible or possible to everybody from an opt-in bottom-up way. And so, well, hopefully, right, like the naive hopefulness at the beginning of every big idea is, where if we organize in these big entities, maybe we then can better synthesize how we can work together, right? Maybe it's easier for like if you think about conflicting interests, right? Like it's maybe easier for like an organized group of, well, let's say you have like the group of, hey, let's protect the ocean, and then you have the group of, well, we are fishermen and we still need to do our job or whatever, and then you have the other people that are, well, we need to dump our waste somewhere, whatever, right? Maybe it's easier for big organizations to have these conversations instead of headless mobs to just scream at each other, right? Maybe that is the case, right? Maybe it also leads to more conflict because suddenly, well, I mean, you can certainly look at examples in history, right, where let's take India for an example, right? Oh yeah, let's just separate the Pakistani and the Indian people. That's a great idea. Well, I don't think in retrospect that was one of the best moves, right? So separating and organizing into geodesical closeness, I don't think it's a guaranteed for a better world. So I think we should be critical of these ideas, but it's definitely one worth discussing.
So yeah, it's definitely this balancing act between how do we make governments and regulation relevant enough to the people that it affects that they're satisfied, while also not creating even more divisive lines that now create us versus them type mentalities, when especially we're moving more and more towards a globalized world, and one in which our resources are dependent on each other and trade is reliant on each other. So it's kind of where this economic structure meets this philosophical or human nature type problem. And we'd have to marry the two, right? So where can you put your human nature values and philosophies aside for a better economic gain? And where can you sacrifice a better economic gain for a more comfortable or satisfactory philosophical life? And yeah, I guess that's just the ongoing conversation, isn't it? And trying to figure that out. But to the point of, you know, is this better done through individuals speaking with each other on a micro scale, or is it better done through organizations or governments talking about it on a macro scale? It's very hard to say, right? It depends on whether or not these groups are talking about issues that affect everybody in that entity or not. And so in those cases, I would say better to go small. But in the cases where these issues affect more people than the macro entities deciding, if they are competent macro entities and ethical macro entities, then it makes sense for those to decide. And that actually brings me to the next question, which is, how can we have effective bottom-up regulation in a more authoritarian country where citizens may face heightened censorship from their governments, right? So if we can trust the entities in power to have productive conversations and discourse and make change that will reflect the needs of the people, great. But if we're in a country where that's not the case, how do the people organize themselves to overthrow that when their public ability to criticize their government or the people in power has been taken away?
Yeah, I mean, like this is a hard question, right? Like, and it depends on what kind of authoritarian country you're living in. Are you living in the one like North Korea, where it's like, where you're just there, you are basically enslaved, and there's essentially nothing you can do about this as an individual, right? Or you're living in one where, well, at least you can leave, for example, right? You might not like it, you might lose your home and your roots and your culture and your family, whatever, but at least you can cross the border and go somewhere else, right? In the latter case, well, I think that's one answer. Just exit, vote with your feet, as Balaji would say, right? And then there's also if you don't want to like leave and exit, but you want to stay and change something, well, the answer is, I think, always organization, right? You want movements. There's like things like civil disobedience, right? If everybody stops contributing to the society, right, where society breaks down, and you can either let it break down or you are forced to listen to the people that are forming this movement. And you see these things to a degree, for example, in China, right? Very much like the poster child of a controlling state, right? But even there, you have people that at some point say, well, enough is enough, and then forces the state to listen there, right? And I think like bringing in ideas of network states, I think ultimately, but this is more on a long-term scale, right? I think a very, very great concept in there is the inherent opt-in perspective of this, right? Usually we are born into a state, right? Like here's your tax number, you go working, you pay taxes, bam, whatever, right? It just happens, right? Like there's no way for you to choose, right? You can opt out, but it just happens. And like if you opt in inherently, well, the only way that you become relevant is that people opt into you, and you're always, to some degree, have a higher mobility of people exiting, especially if it's not necessarily tied to the physical space at first. Though I think even with network states, like if you really think this through, at some point your life will be tied, like in one version, your life might be really tied to one of those states, and then exit becomes still harder to do these things. So keeping this in mind, maybe, so not really answering your question directly, but one thing we can maybe learn from this as well, if we design network states and we do this honestly and earnestly, and we come into this with a honesty about, well, maybe even if I come in with the best intentions, maybe this can still become authoritarian, for example, right? This can be captured, this can be problematic. So designing network states with the design criteria of let's optimize for exitability, right? I think it's a great way of solving this issue, and also um, keeping the accountability, right, the leverage that then the citizen can have against this network state as high as possible, right? So you could even go one step further and say, hey, let's optimize for citizen leverage in our network state. And I think if you do this honestly and earnestly, I think those are the ones that deserve us as citizens.
I see. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So to kind of summarize that and put a bow on it, with the authoritarian governments, it's unfortunate, but it seems like the way to counter it is to understand that, we naturally as humans fall into this sunk cost fallacy because we were born there, because we have the culture there, because our family is there, because whatever, we've tied so much of our identity to this place that it largely doesn't even become a thought to leave, more so than let me change it for the better. But actually, some of the most powerful ways to change it for the better is to leave, because that is what indicates to the people in power that things need to change for the better in order to then reattract you to come back, right? So I think that's one of the really important points there. And then the other is, for these countries to to optimize for exitability, and by that we mean just make it easy for them to leave. It's kind of like as if your company or your country showed you all their cards to begin with and was like, hey, this is what you're going to get. And if we don't follow through on that, right, you got 100% guarantee. If you don't like it, you can leave, no strings attached, right? And that's a very powerful concept. But it goes against the ways that startups and countries have been built to this day, in many cases, because in startups, you want to optimize for stickiness. You want your users to be attached to your company as much as possible, and for it to be as difficult as possible for them to leave, so that you retain them even when a competitor comes along, right? Even if that competitor is better, you have some time to work on improving yourself before a mass migration. And so it's going to be interesting to see, what do people value more? Is it that exitability and therefore, the morals and ethics of the country as leaders, or whether or not that country can deliver a better product, let's say, by having stickiness, because it buys them that time and the feedback loops necessary to improve before people have a chance to leave. And so that's going to be this balancing act as well. But it'll be very interesting to see, and I'm looking forward to it. So to wrap up, Severin, what are some final closing thoughts that we have for any aspiring network state leaders that want to use this technology to influence bottom-up regulation?
Yeah, I think it's let me think. I would say approach this with a sense of earnestness, right? We are all, in the end, I would say we're all mediocre and flawed humans, just right, like trying to do things. And so I would say, well, just embrace this, right? Don't become a false prophet that is portraying yourself as ideal and designing things like if you were this person, right? Because then you're doing no one a favor, but rather just accept this and come from this place, right? This also lets you learn, right? Keeps your eyes and ears open to listen to new information, these kind of things, right? Talk to people, listen, research, challenge your beliefs, right? Change perspective, right? Ask who are you influencing, ask how things can go wrong, right? How can this become dystopian, what I'm doing right now, right? All these things, and how can I then design this better in a way that it's not just a win-win for me and my people involved, but it becomes a win-win-win for me, the people involved, and the people affected by what I'm doing. And I think that's a good mindset to do something that deserves to be done.
Couldn't agree more. I think that's a perfect place to end it. Severin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Everyone, if you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, comment, do all the things, sign up for our newsletter, and we'll see you in the next one.